Dear fathers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's an honor and a great pleasure for me to welcome you this morning to the conference on Ecclesiology and Nationalism. It's a pleasure to see you all. My name is Effie Focas. I, until recently, was director of the Forum on Religion at the London School of Economics. And a month ago, I stopped that position. I'm based in Athens now. And I work at a research center in Athens doing European-funded research on religious pluralism in Orthodox contexts. I'm very happy to be introducing you now to two colleagues. Dr. Lucian Leviston will be our first speaker. I had the pleasure of being a PhD student with Lucian at the London School of Economics some long time ago. Currently, he's a lecturer in politics and international relations at the Aston Centre for Europe, which is at Aston University in Birmingham in the UK. He's the founding editor of the book series on religion, society, and government in Eastern Europe and former Soviet states. That's published by Routledge. His recent publications include Orthodoxy in the Cold War, Religion and Political Power in Romania from 1947 to 1965, and he is the editor of Eastern Christianity in the Cold War, 1945 to 1989, which was published in 2010, and editor of Eastern Christianity and Politics in the 21st Century, which is forthcoming in 2013. To my left, I have Professor Paskalis Kitromelidis, who studied political science at Harvard University, his PhD from Harvard. He is now professor of political science at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Athens. His publications include The Enlightenment as Social Criticism, Enlightenment, Nationalism, and Orthodoxy. From Republican Polity to National Community, Eleftherios Venizelos, The Trials of Statesmanship, and an Orthodox Commonwealth, and finally, Political Thinkers of a Modern Age. I think you will join me in welcoming them warmly for their opening of the full session today on Friday morning.
Okay, thank you very much, Effie. I would also like to extend my congratulations to the organizers for putting together, for bringing us together here from so many parts of the world, and also to thank you for coming here. Thank you for the introduction. I won't speak today about the Cold War, although I'll be very happy to take some questions from then. My paper will focus on three main areas. The first one, I'll look at the nation-building process in southeastern Europe. The topic of today's presentation is nationalism. Secondly, I will look at the concept of symphonia as it states in the Byzantine Empire, what it means and how this concept of symphonia has been applied to this nation-building process. And thirdly, I will particularly look at a specific case study, a so-called the Church of Moldo-Romania, and I realize some will raise some eyebrows. What's that? I've never heard about that kind of church. I always know about the church in Moldavia and Wallachia, and they joined together and they formed what is called the Romanian Orthodox Church. So what about this Moldo-Romanian church? And very grateful to Demetrius here, we were at the conference a few years ago in Budapest when I gave a very similar topic, and I expressed my excitement, said, look, I really found this document at British Library, an English translation of the national wishes of Romanian community in Moldavia, proclaiming the autocephaly of a Church of Moldo-Romania. And very happy, I conducted more research since then, and yes, you'll have the whole environment and the whole political and historical context to see how this church emerged and why was that possible. My paper is very much focused, I said, not on the Cold War, but I'm particularly looking at the first half of the 19th century, because we look at the impact of the French Revolution, the ideas of nationalism and of nations on Southeastern Europe and how that developed. Okay, so let's look at these three different areas. And I would like to start my paper with a rather long quotation from 1859. The date 1859 is rather important because it's the date when both Moldavia and Wallachia, if you remember the map, proclaimed that they would like to have a ruler, common ruler for both countries, and to be a native prince. And the quotation, I would like you to pay attention particularly to the words used in this text. It's a text written, produced by a clergyman, somebody who was very much in favor of unity. So I think it gives you an idea of the environment and what kind of the discussion was at the time, and perhaps that's important also for us today. So, brethren, Jesus Christ has said that for where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. You, brethren, are not 2 or 3, but a real gathering in the name of God. God is in your midst. You are here in the name of the Romanian nation, and the Romanian nation is in your midst. On the flag under which you have assembled, the flag of the Romanian nation, great events, the Romanian faith, the unity, are written with large letters. The church, which is founded on faith, blesses the flag of this faith. You, brethren, through the faith of the Romanian nation, by remaining faithful to this flag, will find the same strength as the church finds in its own saints. The faith of the Romanian nation was not, is not, and will not be anything else but the unity of all Romanians in a single state, the only anchor of salvation, the only port in which the national boat could be saved from surrounding waves. You, brethren, have gathered here in the church of Stephen the Great. Stephen the Great, somebody from a ruler from the Middle Ages. Looking at the altar which he raised to the God of your parents, I think that through this altar you will be able to enter into the wishes of this hero of our nation. You remember that by leaving this place, you are living in order to fulfill a great gesture which for many centuries has been lost for us. You are about to elect a successor to this great hero. Therefore, as his true sons, you could not be anything other than the true expression of his wishes. Myself, as last year from this altar, I said, and I will continue to say, that this great hero has told us that God of our parents will send us a Redeemer who will heal our wounds and accomplish our wishes. May your chosen leader today be the Redeemer expected by the Romanian nation. May he heal its wounds and achieve its wishes. Therefore, brethren, may your election today be that of a real Messiah of Romania. God and the world are looking at you, the church is blessing you, and the whole Romanian nation is waiting for you. I think you have a very strong symbolism here by making connections with the past, with the Middle Ages, but also very, very strong connections to the beginning of Christianity, connecting, making Romanians aware that they need to mobilize and to elect a common ruler, which will be a ruler elect, will be accepted for both Wallachians and Moldavians. And what happened just a few hours after this sermon, that's why I said it's rather symbolic, is that the electors went to a different room and they elected Prince Cuza, which was the first prince, become later the first prince of united principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia. A few words on the Orthodox Christianity and nationalism and in Southeastern Europe. The intrinsic link between Orthodox Christianity and the idea of the nation, as presented in this sermon, was one of the most significant themes throughout the region in the 19th century. Orthodox churches became closely associated with the nationalist ideology through hierarchs and ordinary clergy identifying with their nations and embracing the nationalist programs of their political and cultural elites. If we look in Greece, in 1833, after the political elite proclaimed independence, the Orthodox Church declared autocephaly, which was only recognized by Constantinople in 1850. Seeking the political support of other European powers, Greece embraced the monarchy. The new head of state, King Otto, was Roman Catholic who married an evangelical wife from Germany. He was not forced to convert to Orthodoxy, but the 1843 constitution stated that his successors should be brought up in the Orthodox faith. And the monarchy left its legacy on church-state relations by imposing a German style of ecclesiastical administration. That's in Greece. In Serbia, diplomatic discussions after Karađorđe's first uprising at the beginning of the 19th century and the second uprising resulted in 1830 in the proclamation of Serbian autonomy under Ottoman rule. The church paralleled the political situation and in 1831 was granted autonomy from the Ecumenical Patriarchate. In 38 and in 69, in the constitutions, Orthodoxy was declared as the state religion. In 78, Serbia was recognized by the Congress of Berlin as an independent kingdom, and the Metropolitan of Belgrade obtained autocephaly in 79. The establishment of the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes after the First World War led to a new status for the Church. In 1919, the Church was raised to the rank of Patriarchate. The Patriarch occupied a position in the Royal Council, and members of the Orthodox clergy held seats in the National Assembly. In Romania, now coming back, the 1859 union, which I just mentioned, between the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia and the Prince Cuza, was closely connected to the rise of Romanian Orthodox Church outside the jurisdictional authority of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, imposing his control of the Church, which we'll see after 1889. Cuza introduced the secularization of monastery states, declared Romanian as the only language spoken in religious rituals, and established a synod which followed his rule. And very comparable to the Greece political trajectory, Romanian political leaders sought support from European powers and elected the Catholic Prince Carol I from the Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen family as head of state. In 1865, the Romanian Orthodox Church declared autocephaly, which is what's widely known, which in 1885 was recognized by Constantinople nearly 20 years later. The proclamation of the Romanian independent kingdom in 1881 was accompanied by increasing state control of the church, which led to ecclesiastical instability. The establishment of Greater Romania in 1918 with the incorporation of the territories of Transylvania, Banat, Bukovina, and Bessarabia, if you look around, was followed by the reorganization of the church, and in 1925 the parliament raised the church to the rank of patriarchate. So it took a rather long time. So I think this historical analysis and this historical evolution is quite important to looking very broadly at all countries in Eastern Europe. The case of Bulgaria, which you heard a little bit yesterday, offers a unique example of church-state relations in southeastern Europe, as the struggle for ecclesiastical independence from the ecumenical patriarchate took place before the emergence of the Bulgarian state. The first claims of autonomy came after the Crimean War, resulted in 1870 the establishment of Bulgarian Exarchate. The Exarchate was set up by the Ottoman government and comprised 13 dioceses under Constantinople jurisdiction. Bulgarian hierarchs demanded a national church, and I realize the terms national here might be a bit controversial. However, as we know, in 1872, a synod under the leadership of Patriarch Antimos VI rejected their request, condemning the well-known doctrine of Philotism. The synod refused to recognize the Exarchate, declaring it a schismatic church, and this position continued after Bulgaria became an autonomous principality, an independent kingdom in 1908. and the impact, which was recognized only in 1945 by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and the impact of this can be seen in the interwar period, was the Bulgarian faithful was labeled at that time as probably the least, this sort of quotation, the least religious people in Europe. So something to really think about, because is this one of the factors? Because we don't have a national church in Bulgaria, is this a reason for the high degree of secularization in Bulgaria? A few words about the Orthodoxy and Symphonia, and see how Symphonia connects with the evolution of these elements I've just presented. In Orthodoxy, the relationship between church and state is characterized by the concept of Symphonia, or the system of co-reciprocity, a doctrine which developed in Byzantium. As John Mandorf stated, the great dream of Byzantine civilization was a universal Christian society administered by the emperor and spiritually guided by the church. According to this vision, the empire was considered a kingdom which would last forever, whose political and religious domination would be without competitor on earth, as it was the reflection of Christ's kingdom. Both the church and the state should collaborate towards, as another quotation, achieving a sublime destiny of the people under their jurisdiction, and there should be no conflict between the means employed by the church or the state in promoting the welfare of their subject. While there is a separation between the completely laic character of the state and the religious status of the church, Symphonia promotes equality and an intimate relationship between these institutions, however, with different priorities and methods of operating. The state, on one hand, is interested in its survival within a system of states and its projection in international politics. On the other hand, the church operates with religious methods, leading the community towards the best way of achieving spiritual progress and salvation. The state does not rule itself according to church law, nor vice versa. There is no interdependency, nor is there a complete separation. In fact, the major problem of the concept of Symphonia is that the demarcation line between church and state is unclear. For this reason, religious leaders could achieve strong political roles in society, and political leaders could influence the church position. If we look in Eusebius of Caesarea's writings, the emperor is described as a divine figure on earth with a close connection between Christ and Constantine. Constantine is the great emperor, just a quotation, the imperial god, the emperor of the universe. Constantine Empire was the imitation of the monarchical power in heaven. The emperor is one image of the one all-imperial God. Constantine claimed to be a bishop ordained by God to overlook what is external to the church. And the emperor was considered the 13th apostle, or equal with the apostles, who fought for the right faith, while the patriarch was in charge of ensuring that the community followed the spiritual path towards salvation. The concept of Symphonia acquired a stronger dimension during the reign of Emperor Justinian, who in his systematization of civil law set out some aspects. Just another quotation from his edict to the people of Constantinople in 554. We believe that the first and greatest blessing for all mankind is the confession of the Christian faith true and beyond reproach, to the end that it may be universally established and that all the most holy priests of the whole globe may be joined together in unity and with one voice may confess and preach the Orthodox Christian faith, and that every plea devised by heretics may be rendered null and void. This is very much connected with Metropolitan Kallistos's speech yesterday, with the idea very much of a global religion, this universalism of Christianity at that time. In the sixth novel, another quotation, there are two major gifts which God had given unto man and of his supernal clemency, the priesthood and the imperial authority, hierocene and basileia, sacerdocium and imperium. Of these, the former is concerned with things divine, the latter presides over human affairs and takes care of them. Proceeding from the same source, both adorn human life. Nothing is of greater concern for the emperors as the dignity of the priesthood, so that priests may in turn pray to God for them. And the ideas here have been taken further in the Middle Ages to the creation of the nation state. And you have a document called a Panagoge, who states that the temporal power and the priesthood relate to each other's body and soul. They are necessary for state order, just as body and soul are necessary in a living man. It is in their linkage and harmony that the well-being of a state lies. What's important to remember about these quotations, about this setting up of the concept of symphonia, is that even if the Byzantine Empire disappeared from Europe's map with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, its religious and political legacy for Orthodox regions was apparent. As Henry Gregoire states, the Byzantine Church is the most important of Byzantine survivals. The empire has disappeared, but the Church remains. And through its religious ceremonies and jurisdictional organization, the Church reminded the faithful of the Byzantine model regarding the relationship between Church and state. Myths, religious and symbols of liturgical ceremonials continue to bring the Orthodox people together, even if they were now subject of different political regime. Now, a few words about the case study, as I realize the time is going, on the Church of Moldova, Romania, at the beginning of the 19th century. If you look at the first glance, the nationalist ideology of the French Revolution, the idea that nationalism is a very modern, very powerful phenomenon, the idea that all people, they have to belong to a nation, seemed to have a little impact on the Orthodox Church in Romanian-speaking territories. If you have the map of Southeastern Europe in mind, the Romanians were the predominant inhabitants of the principalities of Wallachia, Moldavia, but also around that, Transylvania, Maramuresh, Bukovina, Bessarabia, Dobruja. But the majority of ethnic Romanians belonged to the Orthodox faith. In 1859, the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia united into a single state. The term Romania began to be used by the state in 1862, and 2 years later the state officially supported declaration of a Romanian autocephalous church, which was recognized, I said, in 1885. And the concept of nationality and nationalism were not intrinsic to the theological constitution of the Romanian Orthodox Church at the time. There are no really tracts or products on nationalism, although there are different hints in various speeches. And you see the Romanian Orthodox Church following very closely the political path towards a national church, a national state. The Romanian Orthodox Church was also a veritable national institution which was closely linked to social, economic, and political structures. In most cases, Orthodox hierarchs were appointed from the families of boyars, that's the leaders, local leaders, thus ensuring close relations with state authorities and its policies. As one of the largest landowners in principalities, just to give you a figure at the time, 2/3 of the land was owned by the church, so the church had a strong role. The church had a prime role in administrating healthcare, education, and aid relief. And although the majority of the clergy was uneducated, it dispensed both ecclesiastical and civil justice, and in many cases worked closely with boyars in local administration. If you look very much in what happened in the first, particularly in Moldavia, because Moldavia is it's a very interesting case at that time. What happened immediately after the French Revolution? You have a rather stable leadership in Moldavia compared to Wallachia, and perhaps that fosters the sense of a national unity, that stability more than in other parts. So you have a metropolitan called Veniamin Kostaki, who established a theological education near the capital. We have a large number of liturgical books published in Romanian. Also, the organic statute, which was the constitution of the principalities, established a ministry of the church under direct scrutiny of the prince, and according to the new legislation, is rather important, the bishops were elected from amongst Romanians, thus ensuring the preponderance of the locally appointed clergy in the higher ranks and not the other clergy from other parts of southeastern Europe. However, Veniamin relations with Prince Sturza, who was at that time, entered tense period after 1835 and will gradually increase in the following years, leading to the Metropolitan's resignation in 1842. And the conflict centered on financial issues, as the prince intended to bring a number of highly productive monastery properties under state control. What you have here is a very much conflict between the church and the state, and the prince trying to impose his authority. And it's a rather long story, but I'm not getting to details. It seems rather amusing for us now, as the Metropolitan received a letter, anonymous letter, and then immediately after that he resigned, fearing that he's going to be stabbed. What happened with a similar case in the past. But he also looked at Russia and the Ottoman Empire as thinking that if I'm going to resign because of my stable leadership until now, I will have support, or there will definitely be a protest from either Russia or from Constantinople. The protest didn't happen, and the prince continued his uncanonical captivity in the church affairs, and without consulting the Ecumenical Patriarchate, appointed his protege. And faced with a possible split in the church, the Ecumenical Patriarchate wrote to the prince agreeing with the resignation, summoning him to reconsider ecclesiastical appointment, and that particular bishop was forced to leave, and another local Romanian native bishop, Meletier, was elected Metropolitan in 1844. Meletier's elections in 1844 was agreed by Prince Sturza mainly because it was seen as the most advantageous for his regime. Meletier was not only older than his the main competitor, Sophronia, will become a Metropolitan later, but he also contributed extensively financially to his election. And again, Russia didn't protest, and the prince's interference in church affairs seemed to support his policy. What's also interesting, at that time that in Meletier's election, Russian clergy traveled throughout Moldavia, trying to convince the Moldavian clergy and faithful to sign a petition proposing the unification of the Moldovan Orthodox Church with the Russian Orthodox Church. So it gives you an idea that if they wouldn't have a national church, then you'll have very much strong influence from the other more powerful churches in the region, as a Russian Orthodox Church tried at the time to unite the Moldovans with them. In 1848, as we know, the revolution throughout Europe did not lead to a mass popular movement in Moldavia, although Meletier and the clergy signed a memorandum which supported the revolution. However, in the same year, a few months later, he died during an epidemic of cholera in the capital. The prince was forced to leave, and a few years later, in 1851, we have a new metropolitan, Sophronia Miclescu. I mention his name because he became rather important. In the first years of his ecclesiastical leadership, Sophronia publicly rejected the possibility of Romanian unification between Wallachia and Moldavia, and favored the conservative Boyer party, which aimed to bring Prince Sturza, which as I mentioned, back to Moldavia. So he was against unification. He was against the National Party. However, he changed his mind. And how that happened, he realized that the Unionist Party had a high level of support among the clergy and the wider population, so there was very much a high popular support, but he was also assured by the French consul in the capital that if you have a unified country, a unified principality of Moldavia and Wallachia, would not affect his seat. So you will still be metropolitan even if you have a united principality. And I have two quotations again from some speeches from the Unionist Party, from two leading figures, which I think also are quite gives you an idea of the discussions were at the time. The first quotation: "The nation is nothing else than a large family. Unity is the most important principle for all Christians. A foreign prince in the United Principalities would not change the religion, because the real ruler of emperors and kings is where the real ruler of all people is, in the heart of his servants." That's an interesting approach. Another quotation: "The Church always prayed for unity of all. If Romanians are called to unity, it means that they are on the path of the universal progress of humanity, while those who oppose unification of the principalities are against the will of God, against the idea of progress of humanity, and therefore are enemies of both God and people, and are only friends of Satan." So rather very strong words, trying to convince the population that you really need to be in favor of unification, you really need to be in favor. You belong to the Romanian nation, because if you don't, then you are in the dark side. And this type of unionist views also found an echo among the clergy. I have a report from the Bacău region from the archpriest, which he claimed that 3/4 of the population in 1857 was in favor of unification. And then the metropolitan entered into conflict with the regency as to what really happened. The great powers decided that there should be an ad hoc assembly in both Moldavia and Wallachia discussing what's going to happen. Do they really want to unite? Do they want to have a foreign prince? And then you have sudden demonstrations in villages, in cities, with the clergy, supported by the clergy. The regency in that conflict of Symphonia very much rebuked and declared that the church should remain only to the religious realm. However, Sophronia replied, saying that this is not a political concern, because even if they had, this demonstration had religious banners and prayed for unity, they were nothing else than congratulating the future electors. And there should be no disciplinary measures against the church or against the clergy joining demonstrations. What's significant and what's rather symbolic and a rather small event, one of those things that you think that if that wouldn't happen, perhaps it would completely change the history as we know today. The elections were held, and the regency very much interfered in the church life and attempted to exclude and basically stated that all the unionist clergy should be completely removed from the list. So if you are going to vote for some electors, the electors on your list are the majority of them are against the unification. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. What happened with the church? Sophronia declared that the clergy and the faithful, against the state rule, said you should not go and vote. You should refrain from attending the voting process. Very much intimidation. So it not only happened later in the Cold War, and we know much, but in 1857, the clergy were taken by the police, by the state authorities. Many were forced overnight to go, and you have to vote. But it also shows that the church was very close and very strongly united in this response. And by refusing to go and vote, the response was taken further to the great powers, which declared that those elections should be declared null, void. And the new electors, the electors with the Unionist Party, were allowed to come back, and then you have new elections by the end of 1857. And on the 4th of November 1857, the particular stance of the Moldovan Church in supporting unification was enhanced when its assembly, which now included the Unionist Party, decided with 17 votes in favor, no abstentions, nothing against, for the separation of the Church from foreign control. And a few days later, on the 20th of December, for the first time in the history of the Church, the Assembly declared the establishment of an independent, autocephalic, and Orthodox Church of Moldova, Romania. The Assembly proposed 14 points for the reorganization of the Church, however, pointing out that it remained in communion with the Ecumenical Church of the East. The Church should be ruled by a synodical central authority in Romania for spiritual, canonical, as well as disciplinary matters, while neither the metropolitan nor the bishops of the country can ever or in any way be elected from among foreigners or naturalized Romanians. The declaration of Moldovan autocephaly was only an official document in the debates of the ad hoc assembly, without an immediate institutional result, and it was not paralleled in Wallachia. And the decision of both Wallachia and Moldavian assemblies were submitted to the great powers, and the declaration of autocephaly was rejected. You have France, England, Russia, and Prussia, and Sardinia supported unification of the two principalities. Austria and the Porte objected. And the Unionist cause then focused on finding the political means rather than the religious mobilization and autocephaly to convince the European capitals. However, despite the failure of the 1857 declaration of autocephaly, ad hoc discussion and these 14 points discussed at the time on the church organization would become fundamental to the Orthodox Church after the 1859 unification. So after 1859, you have a prince, very much a political movement, nationalism as a very much a political movement. But as I presented, the Church 2 years before, by particularly opposing that elections and very strongly supporting the cause of Romanian unity, was one of the main factors in leading to a Romanian, a united Romanian Church. And in conclusion, I just, as I like these quotations from the time, to see how the ad hoc assembly in 1857 ended with a declaration signed by both the church leaders but also political leaders, and that to give you some a flavor of that time. So the quotation says, or the declaration says, 5 million of Romanians, with open arms, with eyes fixed on that great center where the fate of their mother country will be decided, await with all confidence that those magical words that will render joy and happiness to a whole people, that word which will from one century to another transmit to future generations the names of the benevolent monarchs, that word, lastly, which will announce the resurrection of a reunited and autonomous Romania. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucian. That was really a fascinating account of a very interesting case of the Church of Moldova, Romania, and usefully couched in the beginning in an introduction of our topic in the general context of Southeastern Europe. I think it's a very good start to our discussion for the day. And now I'd like to welcome Professor Kitromilidis, who will speak to us about Enlightenment, nationalism, and national state, and their impact on the Orthodox world. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Your Eminence of Pergamos, Your Eminence of Demetrius, our hosts, thank you very much for the hospitality. I also warmly thank the Academy for the opportunity given to me to participate in this very interesting conference that touches on so many issues that I have dealt with in the past. These issues are of critical importance for understanding both history and the contemporary reality. As an introduction, I would like to say that I agree fully with the problematic of the conference, which essentially overlaps with my own topic, and maybe I should stop here, but allow me to make some historical remarks in order to situate the general topic of our conference in the encounter of Orthodox Church and theology with the ideologies of secular modernity in a historical perspective. Some years ago, in 1994, I published a book entitled with a title which is very similar to my current presentation. The title was Enlightenment, Nationalism, Orthodoxy, and this coincides with the title of my presentation today. So I will not repeat what I wrote in that book. I will simply begin my presentation with a methodological reflection that derives from that volume and which has guided my own thinking around this issue of the encounter between the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox thinking with the ideologies of modernity. So we have two internal relationships going on here, orthodoxy and enlightenment on the one hand, and orthodoxy and nationalism on the other. As we all know, these two historical relationships have been treated in many different ways, and very often by completely ignoring the historical sources and of historical data as these are recorded in the sources, so that they do not reflect reality. So we had ideological readings of these relationships. So when I began focusing seriously on this issue of the relationship of secular ideologies with the Orthodox tradition, my motive was to criticize and question the conventional assumptions about the character of these historical relationships. So let's begin with a brief formulation, the brief description of the conventional view. With regard to orthodoxy and enlightenment, what we see, especially in sources that treat this topic from a theological or an ecclesiastical point of view, we see that the dominant view insists on a radical opposition between these two forms of spiritual expression. And sometimes this is rather sad and comic to the point of demonizing enlightenment by those who adopt an ideological interpretation of orthodoxy and consider the Enlightenment as the source of all the evils that have characterized the Orthodox societies of Southeastern Europe. So they look at Enlightenment as the source of alienation and of the distortion of the authenticity of the traditions of these societies. Of course, this is a rather simplistic view which does not reflect very much reality. In this view, Orthodox religion and Enlightenment are completely incompatible historical realities. In contrast, the conventional view with regard to the relationship between orthodoxy and nationality or nationalism, there seems to be an identification here that supposedly orthodoxy and nationalism are one and the same, and this is being supported both by the advocates of the conventional views of the historical relationship of the Church, but also by the enemies of the Church. So the conventional view was that the Church was the pioneer in the struggles of the nation as the guarantor of collective identity. The enemies of the Church also agree with that view, but accuse the Church as being an instrument of the various nationalisms, and especially of Greek nationalism. What is epistemologically interesting is that we have certain phenomena in the 19th century which are being projected to the past in an anachronistic way in order to cultivate precisely this identification of orthodoxy and nationality. So, very briefly, so as not to exhaust your patience, I would like to examine these two conventional views, not from a theological viewpoint, but from a historical viewpoint. His Eminence of Dioclea yesterday examined the issue of nationalism from a theological viewpoint in a very excellent way, and I have nothing to add here. I completely agree with him. So it is worth looking now at this topic from the perspective of historical experience and to look at the evidence of history. So I want to make clear my own position from the beginning and to also describe my methodological assumptions. I believe in my own work that examining the Church as a historical phenomenon should not ignore the character of this institution as a spiritual institution which is devoted to the realization on earth of a special code of moral values. So now I will not enter into the metaphysical issues, which are, of course, part of the character of this church, but I will insist on that point that the church, that is to say, the church is not simply an organization which exists in society, but it is also a spiritual institution which carries certain values, and we should not ignore this fact when we examine its historical role. So it carries some particular values which derive from the teaching of Christianity. This view helps us understand its attitude towards the Enlightenment, and also it helps us to consider the issue of its problematic identification with national and nationalist claims. So this methodological presupposition contains also a radical disagreement that I share, that I feel, with certain approaches of historians which see the church as a structure of hierarchical relations, of power relations, as an institution of power, and as an area of power struggles which divest the church from its spiritual content and consider it only as a secular institution. So I disagree with that. So let me turn now to these two historical relationships. First of all, the relationship between Enlightenment and Orthodoxy. In contrast to what has been written, what has been said about the incompatibility and the radical opposition between Orthodoxy and the Enlightenment, the historical evidence, if you read the sources, especially of the 18th century, if you read the sources from the Orthodox world, both the Greek world, but also beyond Greek Orthodoxy. So if you study these sources, you will see undoubtedly that this idea about the enmity and the radical contradiction between Orthodoxy and the Enlightenment is an anachronism. It is not based on fact. So the relationship and the relevance is manifest in the way that the Church, and especially the Church of Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarchate, as the institution governing the Orthodox in the Ottoman Empire, has used the Enlightenment institutions in its educational work, and we see that with the classic example of the Athonias Academy, where Eugenius Vulgaris, the representative par excellence of the Enlightenment, was taught there. And the Patriarch asked him to modernize the educational work of the Church, and also the Church called him to conduct reforms. We also have similar phenomena in the various reforms of the Patriarchal Academy in the 18th century, both under Vulgaris and later after the French Revolution, the patriarchs and the Holy Synod of Constantinople still turn towards the representative of the Enlightenment in order to modernize the school. And we are all familiar with the case of the school of Xerokrini. Another area where we can examine this relationship between the Church and the Enlightenment has to do with the opposition to those scholars who support the Enlightenment. But if we examine carefully these cases, especially in the second half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century until the Greek War of Independence, and if we look the two cases of official condemnation by the Church of scholars about the religious views, we will find out that these condemnations were derived mostly due to intrigues waged by other scholars who were antagonistic to those scholars. So these other scholars saw the representatives of the Enlightenment as a threat, and they accused them of heterodoxy. And sometimes these accusations were successful, but personally, I think it is important that throughout the 18th century until 1793, we only have two official condemnation of scholars by the Church. And I mean Enlightenment scholars, scholars who expressed the views of modernity in science. And so these two cases of Methodius Anthrakidis in the 1820s, who was accused for heterodoxy, he was condemned. He appeared before the Synod, the Holy Synod. He apologized. And his condemnation was revoked, finally. And the other case was 60 years later, 70 years later, was the case of Christodoulos from Acarnania, who wrote a text that exceeded the limits of the Christian teaching and was an intense polemic against the Church. But even in this case, the condemnation was more the result of a campaign waged by his enemies, by his opponents. And these opponents influenced the Church, and the Church condemned him. But in the meantime, the author had died, so this condemnation has not been revoked yet. There is also the opposite phenomenon, that is the attitudes of the enlighteners themselves, the advocates of modernity in education, in linguistics, in culture, etc. So the attitude of those modernizers vis-à-vis the Church and religion, if we examine their attitude by reading their texts and their writings, we see their anxiety, their concern, their anxiety that they felt during the spiritual transformation that they were undergoing, and also the fact that they tried to remain within a problematic that would not alienate them from the Church. And this is very very obvious in the case of the most characteristic advocate of the Enlightenment, Adamantios Korais, who in great maturity precisely formulates this deep demand when he seeks examples from and cases from the history of the Church in order to stress the fact that the Church contributes to the general effort for the recovery and revival of the education of the nation. And he mentioned several examples, such as the cases of the metropolitans of Ephesus, and the example of Ignatius from Moldavia and other hierarchs. So he mentions these cases favorably. The radical divergence takes place due to the impact of the French Revolution. This is the turning point that really changes things in many important ways with regard to the experience of this relationship in the Orthodox East. And this differentiation is expressed in a very classical way by the Patriarch George V, a very important hierarch and religious leader, who is very deeply concerned about the political implications of those new ideas, since he is the leader of the religious leader of the nation, especially after the drama of the French Revolution. I think the work of Professor Nikolaos Zacharopoulos from the University of Thessaloniki is the best description of the attitude of Gregory V. As the professor says, it is a clear expression of the Orthodox policy during the Ottoman occupation. What Gregory V opposes is the political development of the Enlightenment as a secular ideology towards the direction of nationalism. That is what he condemns, both in his encyclium to the Eptanesians and when he condemns the views of Rigas Vereos and in his other pastoral acts. And in this transition during the period of the French Revolution, we see very clearly also the attitude of the Church vis-à-vis nationalism. And now we come to the other historical relationship that we want to examine. Again, the identification of orthodoxy and nationalism that is very frequently used by the critics of the Church. This identification is not supported by the facts. We are not talking about an identification, but about a historical relationship which is anachronistically projected to the past. At that level, at the level of the relation between orthodoxy and nationalism, the attitude of orthodoxy is expressed very well in the issue of the autocephaly of the churches as it was treated by the Patriarchate. So we have already talked about that, but simply I want to stress 2 points before I conclude. If we examine the sources about the attitude of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Patriarchate insists on the issue of the canonicity, that the rules have to be observed with regard to the various unilateral claims by the local churches of the new nation states of southeastern Europe. And what I mean by canonicity is the respect of the principles deriving from the decisions of the Church and also the respect for the procedure. But the local churches, and especially the local governments, did not observe these rules when they promoted the issue of autocephaly. And a characteristic example of that is the difference in the cases between Romania and Greece and Serbia. Greece, unfortunately, gave a bad example with a unilateral autocephaly, and this example was imitated later by Romania. And as you know, in the case of Greece, we had a schism that lasted for almost 20 years. I'm talking about the Bulgarian schism. But the first schism, of course, was the Greek Schism that derived from the fact that the claim of autocephaly did not observe the rules of canonicity. And if you read the texts, many of the arguments used in favor of Greek autocephaly were again repeated later by the Romanians when they claimed their own autocephalous church. That is to say, they said that we cannot live under a patriarch which is a captive of the tyrant. In the case of Serbia, in contrast, observed the procedures of canonicity and the rules. So there was never a problem with regard to the autonomy of the Serbian church or the autocephaly of the Serbian church. The reverse problem, which costed a lot of lives in the rural population of Macedonia and Thrace, was the case of the Bulgarian schism, the claim of autocephaly by the Bulgarians without the canonical presupposition, which was the existence of an independent state. For the Bulgarians, and from a secular perspective, of course, this is understandable. Their claim of autocephaly was part of the process of political emancipation. However, from an ecclesiastical point of view, this autocephaly could not be accepted since there was no independent state at the time. So that was the deeper reason that led to the schism and the condemnation of the exarchy. So this claim of autocephaly was based on a political motivation and did not conform to the rules. Of course, when the elementary procedures were observed many years after the First World War, the schism was overcome in less than a month after the Second World War, I think in 1946, if I'm not mistaken. So all these evidence show us that this identification between orthodoxy and nationalism is not based on historical fact. They are rather projections to the past of certain situations that were created by historical change. So I will conclude with three clarifications that derive from historical experience. If we look at things carefully, based on the evidence, on the evidence of the historical sources, we see very clearly that despite the terrible experiences of the church during slavery, during the conquest, the practice of the church does not obey the logic of the nations. And if we really reflect on that, I think this is the Christian attitude and hope. That is to say that despite worldly pressures, the church as an institution, as a carrier of Christian values, was able to resist. Secondly, when we see the process of national churches, we have to stress the fact that the church sees these churches as churches of independent states and not as churches of nations. This is an important point in order to understand the ecclesiastical logic and the ecclesiastical viewpoint. Thirdly, with regard to the national role of the various local churches, which present themselves as carriers of a national identity, of national aspirations, and so on. All these can be interpreted as forms of church ministry that are not exclusive to orthodoxy only. This is a mistake that we make when we are introverted, when we look only exclusively at the Orthodox world. But if we examine this in a comparative perspective, then we will understand that this role was not played only by the Orthodox Church. For example, think of the Catholic Church in Poland or Ireland. So this national role is not exclusive to the Orthodox Church. Even in Britain, the cradle of modernity par excellence, if you look at the church tradition of Britain, and their own national saints as carriers of a special British identity, if you examine that, then you will understand that this involvement with the collective life of society is not an exclusive characteristic of the Orthodox Church. And in all these endless discussions about nations, nationalisms, and the theories of nationalism, there is a special study of Adrian Hastings, a professor of church history, who stresses the fact that there is this religious dimension in the forging of national identity. Lastly, this identification that I mentioned before and that I tried to historically contextualize in order to view it more critically, that is this identification of church with nationality and nationalism, is to a large extent it is the result of the national mentalities that were cultivated by the national states during the effort of creating their own national cohesion and unity. And they try to promote that aim by reinterpreting the historical trajectory of the peoples. So, in a certain sense, this is one of the intellectual results of autocephaly, which concerned the detachment of the local churches from the ecumenical patriarchate and their subjugation to the motivations of a national policy of secular states. And thus we had all these historical reinterpretations that led to this identification between orthodoxy and nationalism. Thank you for your patience.
I think this talk has moved us gracefully from an in-depth perspective on a particular case of orthodoxy's relationship to nationalism to a broader theoretical discussion of the relationship between religion, specifically orthodoxy, nationalism, and the Enlightenment. And I think it's a fascinating start of a focus that we should have this morning on the historical aspects before we move into the temptation of bringing it into contemporary terms. So I'd like to open the floor to discussion and take maybe a round of questions first and let both speakers respond before we continue with more.
If we have rounds of questions, we will forget what the first said by the time we hear the last. So perhaps take one, but at a time.
We'll start with one and see. Professor Makridis.
We could pose many questions on both. I would like to make a question to Mr. Kytromilidis about what you said. What you said about the relationship between Orthodoxy and the Enlightenment is correct. However, I fear that it is not helpful in combining these two intellectual streams. For example, the fact that Cyril asked Vulgaris to teach something at the School of Athos did not resolve the relationship between Enlightenment and Orthodoxy. Of course, this shows that the Patriarch at the time was open to different views and intellectual currents, but this does not resolve the relationship of the Church with that particular intellectual stream, like, for example, Enlightenment. And this is something that distinguishes Orthodoxy from Western other churches, like, for example, Protestants and Roman Catholics. These are two Christian traditions that after many years have managed to include the Enlightenment and our post-Enlightenment teachings today. The Orthodoxy remains a pre-Enlightenment religion because Orthodoxy saw Enlightenment as something distant, strange, and kept it at distance. It's not uncommon to see references to Enlightenment as something negative. Of course, there are always some progressive, liberal Orthodox churches, but I don't believe that the fact that they are progressive resolves the problem as a whole. You're right to point this out. It is a fact. That we cannot, in a society that is under foreign and different religious rule, we cannot expect from this society that in this society these phenomena will become will create a critical mass in the different dynamic. What I wanted to stress is the following, that there is still this perspective, even in serious works of serious scholars, that there is an absolute animosity between Orthodoxy and Enlightenment. And what I wanted to say is that this is not proven by history. This is not true if we look at the history. Well, it is difficult, on the other hand, to speak about a post-Enlightenment Orthodoxy, because there has not the necessary talk between the scholars of Enlightenment and the Orthodoxy have not taken place. And why is that? Partly because of the identification of churches with national states. And I believe this is something which underlines the way this conference is organized. I believe it's one of the reasons this conference is organized. When we have right now, for example, the Orthodox Church not being under a foreign rule, but still not developing a problematic, that it's, in my opinion, absolutely natural if we look to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Why is it that the Church does not develop this problematic? It is perhaps because we remain enclosed in these national viewpoints, this national reality, its own post-Enlightenment experience. Mr. Kallaintzidis. Taking Mr. Makridis' remark a little bit further and agreeing with Mr. Kytromilidis, in fact, if we take a closer look to cases like Methodius of Anthrakitis, which is, of course, tragic. We've seen the burning of books in the outside the Patriarchate, even the mob that almost lynched him. Of course, that might be explained because of intrigues and such conflicts, but still, a real issue remains. And you and Mr. Kytromilidis have perhaps given us a response that might help us in understanding that problem. Yes, it's true that the conference is trying to make us ponder about the relationship between the Church and nation states. This is why we included the word "in a postmodern era" in the title, because this identification is not also a problem for the self-conscience of Church, but it also inhibits, it does not allow the Church to enter the modern, postmodern era. For example, there was no development in such thing as a constitutional patriotism in many countries. And even as Greeks, we refer to Isocrates and the fact that Greeks are all those who have a Greek education. We make these references to the ancient Greeks who said such things, but at the same time, we follow a classical German view of the nation state. We apply the ius sanguinis and not the ius soli. So, in my opinion, Orthodoxy is not only pre-Enlightenment, it's even pre-modern. And I wonder whether this is due to historical facts, for example, the Ottoman Empire, or if this is connected to the core of the teachings of Orthodoxy. When in 2002 we organized a series of conferences on Orthodoxy and modernity, we received many positive but also many negative responses. When we tried to publish the proceedings, we saw a gap, something missing regarding the Enlightenment, and I was trying to find someone who could write something about this issue, a balanced approach of the issue, because very frequently the Enlightenment scholars are very hostile to the Orthodoxy and vice versa. And the reason I'm making this comment is this perhaps the result of the way some theologians after 1960 have viewed the relationship of the Enlightenment and the West. If we look to previous texts before the 60s, they were more positive towards the Enlightenment, but after Jan Arras in the 1960s, we see more and more hostility towards the Western world in general and as part of the Western world Enlightenment. So could we perhaps say that there is a dominant theological movement that gave this impression, the fact that gave the impression that orthodoxy is opposed to the Enlightenment? If we, it is correct what you say from a point of, from an epistemological point of view, from the history of the ideas. The theological thinking has progressed through the meeting with the Russian diaspora theology and some, unfortunately, only some of the theological currents of the West. But at the same time, due to sociological reasons, we have an anti-Western spirit, which is not something we used to see in previous years, not only in Greece, but also in other countries. But saying that this view that enlightenment is the source of all ills, I believe that can be explained from the historical development of theology, of these ideas. And I would say there is a paradox in the fact that scholars who are familiar with both Enlightenment and Orthodoxy are nurturing this Manichaistic.
I'd like to give a moment to Lucian to respond as well, and then I'll take a couple more questions.
Thank you. I mean, even if my paper didn't deal very much with the Enlightenment, I think it's important when we speak the beginning of the 19th century to look at the social structure and the religious structures at that time. I mentioned in my paper, for example, in both Wallachia and Moldavia, the church owing 2/3 of the land, and the majority of the land were under the jurisdiction of foreign churches, under the Mount Athos in Jerusalem. So that kind of friction between the fanar and the local churches created very much a friction, and in a way fostered the idea of a national Romanian church versus another national church. I very much agree with Professor Kitromilidis' idea that in the 19th century churches tried to be independent and not so much the church of the nation. I think this concept of the church of the nation, we can see it very much developed after 1850, where the state becomes stronger, the spread of a national ideology in Eastern Europe and Western Europe becomes more predominant. But at the beginning, it's very much true, the church tried to be just independent, not so much just the church of the nation. Perhaps just took it for granted, and after 1850 tried to justify that.
Thank you. I see a hand in the back first. If I may, I'll take your question first, Your Eminence, and a question in the back afterwards. And then you in the back.
Ευχαριστώ και τους δύο.
I'm grateful to both speakers. Fortunately, I'm not very familiar with the subject of the first speaker, with the historical facts. So I will not really comment on the first speaker, but regarding the presentation by Mr. Kitromilidis, I was struck by his observation that autocephalous churches were created on the basis of independent states and not nations. I believe that this division, this difference is critically important, because this is precisely what does not exist anymore in contemporary orthodoxy, and especially on the issue of the diaspora. We have divisions today not on the basis of autocephalous churches of states, but on the basis of nationality, because in the case of diaspora, we no longer have independent states. Therefore, it is not justified for churches who have their seat in different states to involve themselves with the congregation of the diaspora. For example, in America, why should Russia, Romania, Bulgaria interfere with the congregation there? Therefore, we've departed from the principle of creating churches based on independent states, and we have entered a time of nationalism, which is, of course, ethnophilitism. And I believe this is very important. Now, with regard to that and enlightenment, Mr. Kitromilidis, this idea of the nation-state, isn't this idea a result of enlightenment? Isn't there a relationship between the nation-state and the enlightenment? And what happens now that this concept of the nation-state is questioned because of political developments, etc. And another question for Mr. Kitromilidis. How do you see the fact that Evgenios Vulgaris had a very rough time when he visited Mount Athos? Doesn't this show that perhaps we do not accept enlightenment at all levels of orthodoxy? Perhaps at the level of the patriarch there was this will to integrate enlightenment, but the reaction towards Vulgaris at Mount Athos may indicate conflict. Θα απαντήσω, μάλλον θα χρειαζόμουν ένα εξαμηνιαίο μάθημα για να απαντήσω στο πρώτο ερώτημα. It seems that I would need a one-semester course to respond to your first question, because on the issue of nation-states. But I'll try to be brief. In fact, yes, the idea of a nation-state is derives from the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. The idea of a nation-state, which is based on the principle of equality between its citizens, is in fact a par excellence idea of the French Revolution, le Grand Nation. This idea of the great state, le Grand Nation, was presented as the principle of equality contrasted to the privileges of the king in the old regime. So during the French Revolution, we have incidents in which the partisans of the king say, "Vive le roi," long live the king, and the revolutionaries reply, long live the people. This is what created the concept of the nation-state, and of course this propagated throughout Europe and throughout the European political thought. It also propagated to the rest of the world. This is quite clear in history, but the point where in which things are less clear is this anachronistic projection to the past of concepts and ideologies and mentalities that are linked to the creation of nation-states. Nation-states, in order to forge their unity and cohesion, created the idea of unity and tried to project their existence to the past. When a historian comes and says, well, yes, but this is a dynamic process that took a specific form in the context of modernity, and the fact that we can see specific points in time during which the nations were forged, we have insecurity, because the society fears the fact that historians may show their process of creation. And this is what leads to insecurities and problems. No one says that these peoples did not exist before or did not speak the same language before. What we say is that the creation of a state changes society, forges a society that is linked to the existence of the nation-state and includes the church in this new society. And although the church is much older as an institution, the fact that the nation-state is created changes its own form. I believe this is something which is generally accepted in history. But what's more important from an ecclesiological and theological point of view is what we're witnessing today. The fact that there is a change in national cohesion that was created for the survival of nation-states. What we're witnessing today is that this cohesion is undermined through the creation of multicultural societies, which is a current phenomenon, what we often call postmodernity. This is what's happening today. Greece and Italy and other countries in Europe that used to be cohesive, internally cohesive countries, have to face this challenge today. On the other hand, big countries that used to have colonies like Great Britain or France, they receive migrants from their former colonies. But what about countries that did not have colonies? They also have to face the problem of the challenge of multiculturalism. And here lies the great challenge. And this is where I believe we need to understand our responsibilities and think a lot before we find the responses to this problem. This is what I just want to say briefly. Just a thing about Vulgaris and Mount Athos to finish. It is true that there were reactions from the monks. For example, the fact that he spoke in Latin, that he taught in Latin, because the monks said that Latin is the heretical language. But these were reactions that were not really innocent. They are linked to intrigues and conflicts and power struggles between the professors of the school there. And indeed, the Patriarch at some point started to undermine Vulgaris as well, and Vulgaris was forced to resign. So I'm not saying that Mount Athos and the monks there was open and welcoming of enlightenment. What I'm trying to say is that Vulgaris, being familiar not only with Western philosophy and science, but also knowledgeable of the isekhastic tradition, as we see from his later publications, even this person did not manage to reconcile the two worlds in Mount Athos. We had an experiment that went on for 6 years that was forcibly terminated, although there have been some efforts to revive the Athonian school later. But I believe this illustrates both openness and the limits of this openness of orthodoxy towards enlightenment. I believe that the case of Vulgaris is a good example of a person who tried to reconcile, to synthesize something which is necessary in order to open up the orthodox thinking and integrate other intellectual traditions to the extent that these are relevant to orthodox teaching. Δύο ερωτήσεις μας μένουν. I wanted to put two questions regarding the modernity of the nation-state. But what I wanted to ask both speakers, what do we mean when we are studying the issue of nationalism and the church? Perhaps we are not very clear on what nationalism is. Perhaps we're not also very clear on the concept of church, what we mean when we say church. Mr. Lucian gave us a description of church in Romania that had a clear tendency towards autocephaly. Whether that was against the unity of Romania or in favor of an autocephaly in Romania, a national autocephaly. So, if nationalism is an enlightenment phenomenon, we could say that this church was very much in favor of the Enlightenment. Perhaps they were not in favor of Descartes, but they were in favor of Fichte, or perhaps other Enlightenment scholars that referred to the nation and its importance. On the other hand, we have the Ecumenical Patriarchate that is against nationalism, but still, at times, behaves in ways that could be characterized as nationalistic. For example, in the case of the Patriarchate of Antiochia. This is an already autocephalous and independent church. They're not asking for that. They are already, from ancient times, autocephalous and independent. It's the third or fourth patriarchate. Okay, it's one of the five anyway. Well, what they were asking for was an Arab patriarch. They asked to nationalize the patriarchate, and there was a reaction by the Ecumenical Patriarchate to this demand. Perhaps we could say that this was a result of the fact that it did not follow canonical procedure. But at the same time, the Ecumenical Patriarchate did not accept the appointment of an Arab patriarch. They could have appointed themselves an Arab patriarch. So what do we mean exactly when we refer to churches? Do we mean churches who react, who want to become autocephalous, who want to follow nationalistic approaches? Are they modern? or are we referring to a church which is pre-modern but at the same time falls in the trap of nationalism? Because if nationalism is a modern phenomenon, a phenomenon of modernity, then the church is really modern. No.
I think that my concern is fundamentally a pastoral one when I listen to this discussion. And I think there's a danger sometimes when we, important as the historical perspective is, to allow our discussion perhaps to become sort of digging over the rubble, if you know what I mean, the ruins of a situation. My mind is dominated on this question by a sense of crisis, really. And I think that crisis has been upon us since the time of the French Enlightenment and probably earlier. In a way, we've not really said what enlightenment is, and my colleague sitting alongside me said, and which enlightenment do you mean? It's quite a complex thing, and I think we're sort of taking it a little bit too for granted and undefined. But one of the aspects of it that does bother me is that the Enlightenment, if it's anything from France, is something which bears within it a philosophy of secular humanism. Now, that's what we're actually dealing with at the moment. And that secular humanism then is now being expressed socially within the structures of nation states. Now, in my own country, which is Australia, on the other side of the world, which is a very secular country, the churches there still contend for the allegiance of the faithful, Orthodox, Catholic and Protestant. But our nation is, though it doesn't have a separation of church and state, at the same time, however, is embracing all sorts of ideas. These are from little controversies such as same-sex marriage and questions to do with life, abortion, etc., and all other issues which are sort of very hot issues for Christians. These now are a part of the national discussion, and it's happening in all sorts of places throughout the West. And it seems to me, too, that it's time for the Orthodox to stop talking about themselves as if they're somehow or other Eastern. It seems to me that even Constantinople in the beginning is very, very much, the capital of the West. And so one of my anxieties is to bring this discussion, into a family discussion of all those nations in the West, because in a way the virus, if you like, has been propagated by us. It's come from a certain internal collapse, or maybe it's a collapse, who knows, within Western culture, and that's what we're now contending with. But the problem is, if we are so embedded and so wedded to the nation state, or to the nation, the churches, that is, what happens to us when the nation itself begins to for want of a better word, embrace anti-human, or in another way, a pagan perhaps, ideologies? Well, we've seen what happened. The communist bloc of Eastern Europe is rather a good example of it. I think we've all forgotten it. That Marxism didn't come from nowhere. And of course, when that does happen, who is the victim? Well, of course, one of the very first victims will be the church. And one of the reasons the church will be the victim is because it has been unresponsive to the previous regime. It has been too comfortable and in its embrace, and that's when it brings me back then to Vladika Kallistos's remarks last night. He ended with the words from the Epistle to Diogenetus. Everywhere is my country, but nowhere. And I think that has to become almost the byword for whether one is a Roman Catholic, whether you are Eastern Orthodox, or even whether you're a Protestant, in that we're in the cultures contending with them, but and we are to love this world, but not to become so comfortable in it. And that's why I think the great danger of nationalism, in that sense. That's probably enough. That's almost a sermon, but. There's one little remark. I can't remember who made this remark. But
let us respond, because you said too much, and it's going to be problematic to remember everything you've raised.
Enough.
Okay, enough. Yes.
I'll give if it's okay, I'll give Lucian the chance to respond first, and then close.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be brief. Thank you very much for the very interesting comments and very useful questions. What is nationalism? What is church? And the church embracing pagan ideologies in the 20th century. In my opinion, it seems to me very much that the kind of questions we are discussing today were very alive and very applicable at the beginning of the 19th century. I don't think the church leaders or the political leaders or the people at that time had an idea what nationalism is or what the church is. And in fact, you have conflicting situations, conflicting comments by both sides trying to define what that is. Just to give some examples, which I think is quite interesting for the environment where we are right now. In 1812, Metropolitan Dosite Filiti, and Filiti is also a Greek name, he was the Metropolitan of Wallachia, and he was very much welcomed by the local community, and when he died, he wrote a testament, a will, and he endowed some scholarships for people to go to study in Western Europe. And the testament particularly says, it's for the benefit of the nation. So the question will be, what nation? The Greeks in Romania at the time was, it's the Greek nation. The Romanians, the Wallachians at the time said, no, he felt very much Romanian, so it's about Romanian nation. So you see, even he didn't define what that is. And very briefly, on an example from Moldavia, something that I mentioned in my presentation, the fact that by the 1840s, 1850s, you have Russian clergy traveling through the country and saying, sign this petition, you should be united with Russia, not be an independent church. It shows the uncertainty of church structures. In a few years, you could become completely different type of church than the one you are familiar with. So I think that's important to take into account, that uncertainty that existed at the time, and the state coming in and say, no, you are from now on you are Greek, now from now on you are Romanian, you are Russian, and so on. So that's it.
Thank you, Lucian. Professor Kitramili.
We had an earlier question also. Father, you said a lot, and I'm not sure to what I should respond, but I think there is one important issue which you should not forget about, that no matter how much we hear in postmodern discourse about the withering away of nations and so forth, what I find is that nations remain still a very fundamental category whereby humanity is organized, and that ordinary people need the nation as a point of reference and identification. And despite all of the clever and intelligent things we intellectuals have to say against the nation and against nationalism, if you are engaged with practical rather than analytical issues, you have to take that psychological need of ordinary people into account in appraising the significance and resilience of nations and nation states, and all the code of the code of values associated with them, as these values respond to the needs of everyday people in everyday life. And this, I think, creates a number of issues for intellectuals who are engaged in understanding, but especially for institutions like the church, which are involved with pastoral work in society. And I think the important thing for the church to remember is that it is a Christian institution first, and an institution involved with particular nations second, and act accordingly. And I think that the Church of Greece these days is giving some good examples when it goes out and feeds all these foreign workers who happen to be in Greece at the moment as part of this worldwide movement of population. But I think that in all of these really challenging and difficult issues, there is no dogmatic one-way answer. You have to be practical and piecemeal and take issues as they arise on the basis of a code of values that would provide guidance.